Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that hazard risk and immediate risk to health. Often when we're talking about bonded asbestos materials in soil, there may not be necessarily an immediate risk to health in most cases. And when we're looking at the quantity of soil in bonded, particularly of bonded materials, we're really talking more about the magnitude of the hazard rather than the risk itself. And this is important because it brings us back to that information that I gave at the beginning about your reports and what you do as part of contaminated sites investigations. Part of your stakeholders are the community. So you need to have some really clear communication to the community about relative risk. So what is the relative risk of, say, having multiple bonded fragments in soil, even large amounts of it, versus, say, cutting through low density fibreboard in a building? Is the risk the same? And do we go from, if we have 10 fragments to 50 fragments, do we go from low to severe? And often that relative risk kind of description can be misleading if it's not dealt with properly in reports. So it is important to sort of talk about, are we talking about just the magnitude of the hazard, how much material is present, or are you talking about risk, which is exposure and how many fibres may be inhaled? So be really clear about the relative, discussion that you're talking about with regard to the relative risk. In most cases for contaminated sites assessments, we are only going to measure the magnitude of the hazard. Very rarely do we go into risk assessment. If you do risk assessment, the toxicity assessment is well and truly done for you. We have the worst kind of data in one sense, in that we've had quite a lot of people become ill from asbestos-related diseases in our workforce. And so there's very good epidemiological data and good toxicological data around asbestos because of the impact that it's had on people in history. So that toxicity assessment's already been done. So when you're doing health risk assessment on site, your focus really is the exposure assessment part of the health risk assessment. So form in that particular case is important. Are fibres able to be released? Is the material being left undisturbed, or is there some disturbance, so particles in air being created from the tasks and activities happening at the site? For those activities that are disturbing the material such that it produces fibres, what is the frequency, duration? Is there repeated exposure? We do know that the risk, even for mesothelioma, which doesn't have an identified threshold for disease, there is a dose-response relationship. So it does matter how often and how long and how much people are exposed to asbestos. There's been several attempts in the research literature to try and look at, well, what are the soil to air relationships? Can we find one? It's turned out to be super predictable to predict, because there's a lot of soil characteristics and material characteristics that influence the association, so there isn't a consistent association that can be made. So really, to assess risk properly, you would be measuring respirable fibres in air, and that's why they do that for clearance inspections for fibre work, because they are interested, that's a higher risk, and they're interested in if there are fibres in air. So removal work is one of those areas where you get fibres. Renovating and maintenance, you've seen DIY workers are one of our sort of exposure groups that we're really concerned with going into the future. And to give you sort of a bit of an idea of the difference in exposures, as I said earlier in the meeting, I've been doing some monitoring related to master's work, and even for fire damaged material, where I've fossicked through fully protected, fossicked through some dry fire damaged material, and worn a personal monitor while doing that, and had some static monitors in place. I didn't get above 0.01 fibres per mil. So that's sort of replicating someone coming in, getting their belongings post-fire where you have fire debris. If you're doing something like hand sawing, you can get up to 4 fibres per mil. So this just tells you the relative risk difference from exposure to air between sort of something in soil that's bonded, even potentially damaged by fire, to hand sawing, which produces quite a lot of respirable sized fibres and dust. Power tools, you can get 10 to 20. If you look at that sort of side panel there, that's an ASEA research report that was done that looked at, again, another controlled kind of exposure assessment, cutting with a grinder, 100mm circular cut in a sheet. They got up to 2.8 fibres per mil. And then they did an area sample, this is outdoors, and it dropped away at 2 metres to 0.15 fibres per mil. So distance from the source is important as well. Yes, you have a question?
Mils or litres?
Milliliters.
Oh, sorry, it's mils. I modified the slide from litres to mils and forgot to modify those other two. Thank you for picking that up. So what's wrong with my slide? That's what's wrong. I made a change and they didn't carry my units through. I'm normally picking up consultants for that issue and I've done it myself. Just goes to show it's a common error. So don't feel bad if we tell you off you've done that, because we do it too. Yeah, I did swap the units over, so that is supposed to be fibres per mil. So inside, and you see a job, you can see, again, that's a power tool. They got up to 13, so that's consistent with the 20 that's reported in sort of literature around, past use of power tools. So obviously that is time dependent, but we can go right back to 1968, and we even knew back then, using the old conometer for measuring dust, which is how they used to do it, that the person who is doing the work is more exposed than the person sitting away. And you can actually see in that picture that might not see that there's kind of a mask on that person doing the job, and the occupational hygienist or person doing the monitoring back in their day felt that they were okay being at a bit of a distance. I'm not in a dust cloud, I'll be fine. So that, we kind of knew these things, that exposure varied, distance from source, exposure time, all these. So we've known this since the 60s. So this isn't really new information, but we can, it's still confirmed. So moving on to the assessment part of the actual guidelines themselves. Just to note, do you remember seeing in Eve's presentation, there was this like ceiling panel? So this is low density fibre board, and it was just like this panel with like perforations in it.
It's a bit like pegboard, yeah.
Yeah, you see that picture there? That's exactly the same product.
Punched out or wet.
No, that's in soil. So, and this is why I actually think you actually need greater competency to be a contaminated site consultant identifying materials in soil than if you're a building surveyor. Because you've got to see it in soil, damaged, in a different state, covered in, discoloured by soil and the surrounding environment. And how do you pick that out from like a root system or anything else that's sort of fibrous in soil? The reason I knew that was fibreboard is that prior to being reduced to that state, it was kind of, sort of still in a rectangle kind of shape, and it kind of looked fibrous. And this is friable with respect to a material in soil. So low density fibreboard in soil is very definitely friable.
And the reason we class it as friable is because instead of being in a cement matrix, it's in a plaster matrix, so it breaks down more easily. Sorry, I think, did I holler that enough for everyone to hear? Great, okay.
So it's in a plaster. It's basically the strength of the bonding material matters. And the percentage asbestos in the material matters. And those two things, if you've got a high percentage asbestos or not as good bonding material in the original manufactured product, by now when it's reached the end of its useful life, it's now more likely to be friable. So asbestos cement does tend to retain its integrity, so that's a relatively good thing in the sense that that's probably the most common asbestos contaminant in soil that we have. So there's been some clarification in the update around the categories. I like to call them categories rather than definitions because I don't want to confuse it with the WHS definitions of friable and non-friable. So in contaminated sites, we have 3 categories of material in soil, that is asbestos-based material. You have your bonded ACM, your asbestos cement fragments, which are, very, very common. You will see those in soil, you will see their impact, you'll see how much they're broken up, whether they're sort of broken up into larger fragments or if they've been pulverised into something smaller, which means maybe there was some mechanical action that has happened. You'll have fibrous asbestos, which is material that was originally friable or has become friable over time and is now present in soil, like your low density fibreboard. Probably coated in soil, may be difficult to see and mixed with other material. If it's mixed a lot, if it's in a large amount, you'll probably be able to recognise the material and see it. See that there's fibre asbestos in the soil. You see a large clump of fibre asbestos in the soil and recognise it. If it's a smaller amount of material, or if you're looking at the edges of your delineation of your area of contamination, you won't be able to see it anymore. At that point, you would assess it as AF. So it becomes AF only because it's now distributed in the soil and you can't actually see it, and the only way you'd see it is if you give it to Matt and he looks at it in the lab and tells you, I found some material in this soil. So AF really, asbestos fine category, is really only material that is now small enough and mixed in soil enough that the only way we see it is if we give it to the lab to look for it. And in that case, you may find friable material and you may find non-friable material. And what that means with regard to your characterisation of the site is up to you, the assessor, not up to the lab analyst. So that's an important point to make. Now, with asbestos fines, it is strictly a size category for the main part, and it's a material that's less than 7 by 7 millimetre. This size was originally chosen because of the thickness of an asbestos cement sheet. So it's saying that, you know, if you've got small enough fragments that pass through a 7 by 7 millimetre sheet, then we're talking about, you know, material that's too small to really readily see with your eye, and we need to kind of look at the soil more carefully in a lab situation. It corresponds to, I know in the NEPM it says it corresponds to friable material, but it probably more accurately corresponds to asbestos contaminated dust or debris with relation to the work-safe linkage. And then with that, you have to make a decision, unfortunately, as the assessor, it's on you. How much of this can you have in the soil before you kick it into it's now contaminated and needs reporting, or this is minor, trivial amount of contamination and we characterise it in that way. So it's up to the assessor to make that decision. What about fibres in soil? Well, we don't still have an accurate and accepted method for quantifying fibres in soil. So there are ways that you can do that. And the problem with that is that you can actually look at a very small amount of soil and be very precise about how much fibres is in that small amount of soil, but then how representative is that very small sample of your entire site contamination? So it becomes a really difficult interpretative mess if you're unsure about what to do in this state. So with soil criteria, we tend to base it with the guidelines, with the original guidelines and with this update, on the source material, the material that you can find in soil, both the larger material and the debris. That is measurable, that is more quantifiable. And we take a precautionary principle. Basically, if you find the source material, then potentially you have contamination that could lead to exposure. And I can't reiterate enough, we're not suggesting there's an accurate quantification of low level of respirable fibres, but you can use existing methodology to see if there are fibres in the soil and what that means with regard to your assessment and your characterisation of the site. In the US, they do assessments based on activity-based sampling, and what they found, and this is sort of leads to the sort of the soil air criteria, they have found inconsistent results with what's in the soil versus what they find in air. And they've also found that the fibre size distribution that's in the soil doesn't necessarily match what they find in the air. So it is a problematic sort of linking soil criteria, which really, again, as I said, looks at the magnitude of the hazard to what might be a risk in air. In terms of the process that we've got in the guidelines, follows very much the updated guidelines, the same process as before. So you gather your information about the site, you look at your site history, you do a site inspection, you get an idea of the nature and extent of the contamination. Is it bonded? Is it not bonded? How much of it is there? How deep does it go? How wide does it go? And you determine from that what to do next. So if you've got simple surface contamination, someone's obviously had a removal job, they've just come and dumped it all on your site, you can treat, and there's simple surface impacts, you can delineate really easily where that contamination is. It's sort of a pretty fresh dump, a legal dump. You can probably treat that as a removal job. So that doesn't mean that because you don't report it as a contaminated site that it isn't managed properly. You still should have an asbestos removal control plan in place. You should still get a licensed asbestos removalist, and you should still get a clearance report. So just because it's in soil doesn't mean it has to be a con site. It can mean if it's simple and obvious and on the soil and you can remove it, just treat it as a removal job. So that's what we talked about, choosing the legislation that's most appropriate, that gets the job done quickly and efficiently as possible before the material spreads. If you have simple surface impacts that are less than the 10 square metres all up, then you could conceivably have safe work process in place where people go around, pick that up, bag it, take it to a landfill site. If you've got a nature and extent that's beyond a simple removal job, and again, the assessor would need to determine that. It's up to you where that line is drawn. You would need to report the site to the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, and then go through the contaminated sites inspection, assessment, remediation, management process. If you're in doubt about where the line is, just report it. That's the easiest thing to do. Just report it, and Bill and his team will let you know what you should be doing next. Or they'll just process it as it is. So once you've reported it, it's now a contaminated site and subject to the contaminated sites guidelines, subject to our guidelines from Chapter 2 onwards, and requires to go through that process. At that point, you can look at, is there an immediate threat of fibre release from either the activities that are happening on the site, the conditions at the site, materials friable, not controlled. You may need to put some immediate controls into place. Do that first. We always do that first. Then you work out, are there any data gaps? If there aren't any data gaps, if your preliminary assessment of looking at the nature and extent of the contamination has given you all the information you need, and you can characterise that contamination in a PSI and report it and move towards remediation and management. If there are data gaps, then you should develop a sampling plan. We see a lot of cookie cutter sampling plans. We don't like to see those. What we'd like to see is sampling plans that relate to addressing your data gaps. And then you can interpret that information appropriately based on your data gaps. If you do need a break, by the way, I notice a few people are needing a bit of a break, please do so, that's fine. So yeah, look at your data gaps and do any further investigations to address those data gaps. And then obviously once you've addressed your data gaps, again, characterise your contamination and write your report and move towards remediation and management. So with your site assessment, we really emphasise in the update that we want to see a conceptual site model. I don't know why, but for some reason for this contaminant, we don't tend to see conceptual site models, but we'll see them for other contaminants. There's no reason why a conceptual site model shouldn't be included. It works in the same way for asbestos as it does for any other contaminant. You still have a source, a contaminant source. You still have a pathway, which is the air, and you still have a receptor. So we still want to have information about the conceptual site model that you have for the site, and who the receptors are and how they may interact with the material based on the activities that are happening with the site and what their exposure potential is because of that. So we do want to see that, and I'm telling you, if you do that, and where I've seen it done, it really helps with risk communication at the end of your report. So it's a really good tool, useful tool. It's in the NEPM, you're required to do it. It's in the con-site guidelines, it says that you're required to do it, and for some reason it's quite rarely done. So something that we would like to see done a bit more with asbestos site assessments. When you're looking at your sampling plan, again, we want to see sampling plans that are tailored to the data gaps or to your situation at the site. So we've seen, really extensive samplings done of some sites where, you just basically concluded that the site was contaminated and you knew that before you did any of the sampling. If your decision is, we just need to know that it's contaminated, then we're going to go to remediation and management, then probably your sampling plan is going to be quite simple, which is how far does the contamination spread, and that's the area that we're going to remediate and clean up. So what confidence level is necessary for decision making? You may not need to know to the nth degree what fragment is in 500 mils of soil if you're just going to clean all that area up. So you need to know what you're going to do, or have an idea of what you're going to do with the site in order to sort of decide what your sampling plan is. And your sampling plan should be addressing those data gaps. And ultimately what you're saying is, how will we use this data that we collect during our sampling to either verify, disprove or modify the conceptual site model that we've developed? So this is kind of, you know, contaminated sites assessments 101, but it's something that we just, for some reason, as I say, in asbestos reports and site investigations, you know, all those boxes going through those preliminary steps aren't ticked, and we just see cookie cutter. We're just going to do some bucket sampling and AF sampling, and we're just going to work it all out in the end what this all means. What we would prefer to see is that you have a clear objective with your sampling. I'm sure your clients want to see that, or clients that are listening want to see that, because, you know, then they're not paying for work that isn't necessary for people to do in terms of extensive sampling. There's been, since the original guidelines came out in 2009, there's been a lot of discussion and debate around this use of the contamination that you see as the primary measure of contamination. So can you use bonded material as the primary measure of contamination? What we think, after many years of using the 2009 guidelines and working with yourselves in the industry, is that it can be used. We do know that the source material for fibres, so while the fibres themselves might be small and invisible, their source is not. So the source material for where these fibres come from is visible, and it's a physical material. So it is able to be seen in soil. So we've given some information in the update around field sampling, and, you know, the fact that you can rely on asbestos bonded, asbestos cement materials being the primary measure of your contamination. So your percentage figures are going to be driven by the larger size material in soil, albeit that that's not where the risk comes from. The quantification in soil is going to be driven by that larger amount of material. There is greater flexibility in the update in how you do AF sampling. There's a bit more descriptive wording in there, so you can have a look at that, see that it hopefully clarifies some of the issues around when to do AF sampling and when not to. But basically do it when you need to do it. So if you've seen some pulverised material that looks like this, you know, it was originally bonded, but it's been pulverised down into very small material, obviously some mechanical damage has happened, you may want to look at the AF sample just to see what you've got on that site if you've got a lot of really fine material. You know, if you're fairly assured that it's fairly intact, broken pieces, then you probably don't need to. And, you know, a decade of sampling has shown us that you rarely find AF even close to 10% of the bonded material in the soil. So not even close to that. So that's why we took that sort of, it's going to be less than 10% the AF, because often it's even less than that. Like, we've rarely even found 10% of asbestos fine material related with bonded material. So for these reasons, the fact that you're kind of having to think through the process, and particularly with the bonded field sampling, you can make decisions on site. So if you're taking samples using, you know, your 10-litre sample and measuring how many fragments you have at the site and quantifying that, you can make decisions on site as you go about, like, do we need to extend the area sampling, take a few more samples here, do we not need to? So because of that reason, because of that ability to make decisions, because you've got results immediately, because you're looking at a physical contaminant, we do expect the person on the site doing the assessment and guiding the fieldwork to be competent in asbestos. And we required that in 2009, and we've reiterated that now. So there should be a person on site who's supervising those fieldworks, who's competent in understanding asbestos contamination, who can identify some of these products that are difficult to see in soil and relate them to being asbestos. One of the things we don't see, which I'm surprised about because I would be doing more of this kind of sampling, is more ID sampling. So, for example, if you've gone out to commercial sites that are contaminated and we see suspect material that looks fibrous, we will take a sample to see if it contains asbestos. And we get some hits, mostly we get hits, some misses. But where are the misses in the reports? Like, rarely do I see a report that says we've saw this sort of suspect debris in soil and we've just taken it for a PLM ID test to see, well, does this thing that we've seen that is a bit suspect because it's a bit fibrous, we don't even know if it's asbestos or not. Is it asbestos? Let's just do a quick ID check to see if it contains asbestos. I rarely see anything like that, but if it was me doing soil assessments, I'd probably be taking ID samples like that all the time of the source, you know, physical materials, and saying, well, is this asbestos or isn't it? Mostly people pick up cement, asbestos cement, and field technicians are really great at spotting asbestos cement. But we have been on sites as officers where we've seen that, yep, they found the asbestos cement, but here's this friable product here that they've completely missed. So maybe some rope seals or some fire blankets, completely missed, because the field technicians are only used to looking for asbestos cement. And arguably those things that they've missed, those products they've missed, are more of a risk than the asbestos cement fragments. So that's why I think you really, really need to make sure that the person on your team who's supervising the works is experienced in identifying asbestos products. And there's plenty of training, work-based training, building surveyor training available that can upskill contaminated sites teams into that area, into that space. So that is in the guidelines, really the need to be competent. And, you know, we're saying, you know, we've seen whole CVs in the past, so we've updated the guidelines saying we don't need to see your whole CV. We just need to see the bit of your experience and knowledge that relates to asbestos to show that you can, you know, supervise the works at the site. I'm happy to take questions through my presentation, by the way, if you have questions to break up me speaking as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to put your hand up. So we've given you some more information on inspection methodology as well. So we often have been asked questions about, well, how big should my grid sizes be for inspection? So we've given you some very specific detail around that. So basically said, if you've got areas of your site that you're not sure is contaminated, there's potentially no reason to think that it might be contaminated, you could probably do a large grid size walkover. And so we're just going to check over that part of the site that we don't think is contaminated, or even the whole site if there's no suggestion of asbestos contamination. Just do a large grid-based walkover and see what we can see. And in that time that you're doing that, you're not just looking for asbestos, you're looking for material that may be co-located with asbestos. So construction and demolition waste, or other material that might, you know, commercial, industrial waste, other material that might indicate there may be an asbestos issue at the site. You know, the age of when that material might have turned up, all of those things are important in your initial assessment. So for that, we'd be looking at, say, a large grid. But once you know you've got an asbestos contamination, okay, so we have buildings at this site, they did contain asbestos, they were removed, but with no clearance certificate, so we're going to need to make sure there's nothing left in the soil, or we know this area is contaminated, then we would be wanting to see a small grid-based assessment to look at, you know, what is the quantification of the asbestos, what is the extent of the contamination in that area where we know or suspect that there actually is asbestos contamination. So hopefully that makes sense with that update. And as Bill mentioned, we do want you to comment on, you know, overall at this site, even if we're not looking for asbestos, we're telling you we did check for asbestos, we didn't forget. So sometimes we don't know if you just forgot to check asbestos and that's why it's not reported, or if you checked and wasn't there. So really that part of the guidelines just says, tell us that you checked and that you didn't find it if it's not there. So one of my biggest beefs, I guess, when I was looking at reports, I don't look at them anymore, is non-representative sampling. So with taking your samples, even your 10-litre sample, you're supposed to be quantifying how much material is in soil. And it's very difficult to do that if the sample that you're taking includes both contaminated soils and not contaminated soils. So, so really what we want you to do is to make sure when you're doing your sampling that it is looking at your contaminated layer or your suspect contaminated layer of material, and that you're actually quantifying, your quantification actually means something because you're actually looking at something that is representative of the material that's contaminated. So you need to be representative in order to get any kind of accuracy or even anywhere near kind of understanding of the estimate of the concentration. And at the end of the day, it is an estimate. So it is very much an estimate of what the concentration is. It's not a very precise, it is essentially bucket sampling by definition. So it is an imprecise estimate of quantification. It just gives us an idea how bad is the contamination at this site. Now we have set criteria around that. but really at the end of the day, it is a rough estimate. So there is going to need to be some professional judgment around what these results mean. We have got a nice little table in there now to show you what a contaminated layer looks like and to make sure that you're not diluting your sample by the way that you take your sample, so that's important as well. We've seen some quite big variations in sample concentrations based on how you've taken a sample and how well you've taken a sample. When you do report on the contamination that you find, make sure that you report the type of contamination and the form that it takes. So it's bonded, friable, etc. Also the overall quantity and spread. So even if you're not doing bucket sampling, if you're just doing surface assessments, and there's isolated or sporadic fragments, the description that you give us should give us some idea of the quantity and spread. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a percent weight by weight calculation if it's not relevant, if the contamination is too low. But giving us a picture of the spread of the contamination and the overall quantity is great, and then also basically informs your decision of what kind of removal or remediation needs to happen because of the quantity that's there. Okay, so we've selected the Class B or restricted licence removals because of this reason, or the soil contractor with a safe work procedure is picking up any fragments that they find when they do these additional cutting and filling work, you know, and it's all under a safe system of work and they've all been trained and it's all, you know, it's all under 10 square metres and we're all compliant with that. So, you know, so having enough information is important so you can make those subsequent decisions about remediation and management. So with your asbestos fines analysis, I've already mentioned it should be based on any data gaps that you have. Do we need to know about the finer debris in the soil? Do we expect that there is finer debris in the soil here at a quantity that is significant, non-trivial? And if so, we need to address that data gap. The lab report should give you a really good idea of what's in that asbestos fine sample. So sometimes I just see lab reports that have got sort of a general description and quantity, but really it would be great to have, for assessors at the site, to have an idea of the size and appearance of all the bits of debris that are found within an AS sample, because that informs you about what's in that AS sample and how it might relate to the other information you have about the site and what's happened at the site and how broken down the material is at that site. It really is up to the assessor to interpret, and bearing in mind, you know, AF analysis is also an estimate of contamination as well. It's not a precise figure. You know, the reason we don't, and I think this information is kind of lost in time, the reason we don't have site-specific criteria for friable or AF materials is because we said we can't precisely quantify below 0.01% because of all the, you know, all the errors that can be associated with taking that kind of sample and it being representative of the contamination. So basically we say between 0.001 and 0.01, you've got contamination, but it's somewhere in there is the best you can do. You can't really say that 0.005 is different to 0.008% weight by weight asbestos, because the error margins are too large for you to say that. So basically, below 0.01, we found some, is kind of what you're saying. So this then means that you've got to get all this information you have, all your sampling data, how many samples were positive, how positive were they, what's the quantification, was there larger material, was there fine material. You've got to get all this information as the assessor at the end of the day, put it all together and compare it against site criteria and say, does it comply with the site criteria, are we above or below? And obviously at this point there's going to be professional judgment, and you need to use your discretion in interpreting individual sample results that might be above 0.001, but where you may not have a large number of positive samples. You will need to use your discretion about what those samples mean. And if you explain your thinking, your thought process to us as you make that decision in the section called characterisation of contamination in your report, then we can come on this journey with you to make the same decision that you've made as a consultant and agree with your conclusions. If you walk us through that process in your report, sometimes you do that in your head, but you don't necessarily represent that decision-making process in the report, and we're left a little confused, and that's often why you might get some follow-up questions from us or DoH as to how did you get from here to here? And it may not be that we don't agree with you, it may be that we just couldn't follow your thought process because you didn't give us enough information to do it. So just make sure you give us enough information in your reporting that we can follow your decision making with regard to the site characterisation and your decision that it is contaminated or not contaminated based on the site criteria. Take us on the journey that you took. Tell us the story. So characterising really is telling us the conclusion of your story that you've gone through in your assessment process. What was the type and condition of asbestos that you found? What was the quantity, the concentration of the material that was present in the soil? How deep did it go? How wide did it go? What soil type do you have? If you've got sandy soils, your accessible soil level, somebody online asked the question of how deep can the OC hygienist deal with it? Well, if you've got very sandy soils like you do in WA, you might have to go deeper than 10 mils. You've got to look at, well, how far is just the normal traffic at this site mixing this material in the soil? So, a step in the ground and the coastal stands can go down a foot. So, that's surface soils. So, if you're examining surface soils, examine the disturbed soil surface layer where material can have moved between through activities that are happening at that site. That's how we want you to look at that. In some cases, you might have really hard compact soil and you're really only dealing with what you can see on top. You don't actually have to look at, deeper down if it's really compact soil. The extent and the depth of the contamination, what are the soil types and physical characteristics, what surface coverings are there at the site, and if you've got vegetative cover, you've got to deal with it. So I've heard many times that, we had lots of vegetative cover, so we couldn't do a walkover. That's fine, but you can still test pit. So you can remove some of the vegetation cover, do some test pits, and look at is there any actual contamination if we think there's sort of waste fill here or whatever. You can test pit using a sampling density that's in the table in the guidelines and say, hey, is there actually contamination in these soils? And you can do surface scrapes as your test pit rather than very deep scrapes, depending on what you define as your soil contamination layer, if that makes sense. Now, as I mentioned, usually at that point, 90% of sites end there. You found asbestos, you found it above the criteria, and you're going to remediate and manage it. And that's a perfectly acceptable solution to make with asbestos because it is a controlled substance and we're trying to eradicate it from the environment. So unlike other substances, very rarely would you go to a health risk assessment stage because it's a controlled and banned substance, so you're going to have to manage it anyway. So that's fine, but be careful that at this point that you're not making really alarming comments about risk because you just decided to manage it because it's above the criteria. That is an acceptable decision to make, but it's not necessarily about the risk, it's about the fact that this is a controlled and regulated substance, and we do our means of dealing with this particular substance contaminant is eradication and removal and control. So if you are going to do a health risk assessment, which has been done in a number of cases where remediation is difficult or there's been community concerns or we have friable material and we want to get a picture of past exposure and whether or not there was an issue, then you may want to move to the health risk assessment step. In most cases where consultants have moved to a risk communication step, we hope to do what we've done in the past and continue our open door policy, so you can contact us and we can talk through you and meet with you around how to go through that process. But yeah, a lot of that you would now be looking at definitely including air monitoring as part of your assessment stage for health risk assessment. Looking at air monitoring for activities that either have happened or will happen on that site. Now, a note, because we have EEP here still from WorkSafe, if you are doing any simulated activities, which we have done at some sites, depending on the level and type of contamination present, you may need to actually get WorkSafe Commissioner approval to actually disturb the material to do sort of that kind of testing. So just be aware of that. You can do it, but you may also need WorkSafe approval before you start because you are disturbing asbestos. We have kept in the update the ability for you to develop site-specific criteria. When we did the workshop for the consultation draft, I think there was a lot of confusion around how we had originally written this into the consultation draft, around the sort of adjustment factors that you could have. So we've taken the adjustment factors out and we've basically said, if you want to do this, if you want to adjust the criteria and with a maximum adjustment to 0.1% weight by weight asbestos, because that's the DoH's classification of asbestos or carcinogen, class 1 carcinogen, you can, but probably the best thing to do, because this is really not really been done to date, is engage with us when you're going to do that, and then we can assist you through that process if necessary. So at least for the first few ones of these that come out, perhaps we can do this in a more collegiate way if you're at a particular site where you might want to adjust your site-specific criteria. And there's things like moisture, type of fibre, contamination depth, lateral spread, the analytical method that you've used to try and find out and quantify fibres in soil. So there are some methods coming out internationally that can look at fibres in soil. And also fibres in air. So if you're really getting into this sort of, new space that's out there, then yeah, we're happy to come on this journey with you, and then we can decide together like what can happen in this space. Having said that, when you're doing your health risk assessments, these factors that we've incorporated in the site-specific criteria section can be used as part of your exposure assessment information. So if it's a very moist, there's high moisture in the soil, that's going to reduce the risk. We know that, moist soils, rarely release fibres. So, so all these factors are, can be used as part of your risk assessment, even if you don't use them to adjust site criteria. Pardon me. We have updated some information on stockpiles. One of the items that came out of the consultation draft was that people wanted us to align with the sampling protocols for other contaminants in stockpiles. So we've done that. So the number of samples that you take for stockpiles has changed. So you need to take a minimum of 3 samples for anything less than 75 cubic metres, and then 1 sample foot, and 1 extra sample for every 25 cubic metres more. Now, that doesn't mean that we necessarily want you now to start creating and sampling stockpiles on contaminated sites. In fact, that's the last thing we want you to do. When you're doing contaminated sites assessments, what we want is for you to not disturb the soils while you're assessing what the nature and extent of contamination is, because that's going to mess up your remediation and management plan potentially. So we do prefer that you assess your soils in situ as they were when you found them. So the only time you really want to be assessing stockpiles if you've done an oopsie, you started digging through some soils, you weren't aware asbestos was there, and now you have a stockpile that you're not sure about. So now you have to retrospectively assess, was that contaminated soils? The other reason which you might assess soils is that you're now taking this material off-site and it might have suspect contamination in it, and you want to know, can you reuse it, or does it need to be disposed as asbestos waste? So I've done a little flow chart there for you. I'm basically saying, well, if you've got contaminated stockpiles, then you need to remediate them. You really don't need to go through the, minimum 3 samples, additional samples. Basically, you've got a contaminated stockpile, you're just going to have to deal with it, remediate it. So you don't have to, spend lots of money doing the extra number of stockpile samples. If you've got suspect contamination, then you can either treat it as contaminated, or you can develop a sampling plan that takes into account the new sampling regime. When you're doing a sampling plan, again, we're going back to what are our data gaps. So if we're dealing with bonded ACM only, then our sampling plan, using that number of using those sample numbers that are required, can be done for bonded material only. So you don't necessarily have to do AF samples as part of your sampling plan if it's bonded material only. If your suspect contamination is bonded and mixed friable with soil, then you're probably looking at AF samples as part of your sampling plan. So again, it's what are your data gaps that you need to address should develop your sampling plan. So do I need to sample my stockpile for ACM only or ACM and AF? That's a decision you need to make based on that site-specific information that you have. If there is no evidence or suspicion of contamination, then there really is no reason to have to sample that stockpile for asbestos. But if you are using, so basically the way that we would see that you would manage that is if you're on a site, you've got stockpiles, they're getting moved around. What we would hope to see is for any sort of cut and fill kind of work, any development work, any construction work, that all people on site are trained with basic asbestos awareness, that they all would know asbestos kind of roughly if they were to see it as part of their training and induction, and that if they see anything, they report it. And then depending on what's reported and what you find, you would be going up to one of the other steps, suspect contaminated or not. So that's kind of how we would envision that working in a pragmatic, practical sense. So once you've assessed the site, characterised it, obviously you want to move towards remediation. And I have mentioned that, you know, there's a lot of other caveats on asbestos. You know, we can't import it, we can't sell or supply material that has asbestos in it. Doesn't matter about the risk, you just can't do it, it's prohibited. There's prohibition on reuse, again, doesn't matter about the risk, it's prohibited. And obviously you have to comply with waste and fill criteria. So when you're moving material off site, you need to be aware that it's controlled, and when you're managing material on site, you need to be aware that it's a controlled material. So you've done your risk assessment, and that's science-based, but when you get to your risk management plan, your remediation plan, you need to consider all the other elements, all the other policy, governance elements, what's acceptable to stakeholders, etc. So your risk management plan may not reflect the risk assessment so much as all these other factors that come into making the decisions. And obviously as part of all that, you need to be able to, especially when you're going into a quite extensive management remediation plan and the risk isn't particularly high, you need to really be really good with your risk communication about, well, this is what the risk assessment showed and this is why we're doing what we're doing with our remediation and management. So you need to be really clear with your stakeholders about the separation between your risk assessment decision and your remediation and management options that you're putting into place. And that's okay with kind of making decisions at that tier 1 level where, you know, our risk assessment decision is really basic, which is we found some, so we're managing it, above criteria, so we're managing it. Because basically that allows us to record that there's contamination on the site where we're managing it in situ, people know it's there, and it protects future generations from any potential exposure. And that's really the job of the Contaminated Site Act anyway, is just to make sure that we have a record of any contamination that remains at a site. If there is containment on site, that site will obviously end up with restrictions on use. You can't interact with that material without some protection of exposure. So now the new updated guidelines talk about the need for a site management plan. It basically says that if you have cover for a public open space that's at less than 1 metre, or for a developed site that's at less than 0.5 metre, then we want to see, regardless, a site management plan. So we definitely want to see a site management plan. Now, this is not an instruction of what you can get away with. This doesn't mean that if you have, this is a very important point, it's not an instruction of what you can get away with. That means that if you have cover more than 1 metre or more than 0.5 metres on either of those two types of site, it doesn't mean you don't do a site management plan as a default. It means you decide whether or not you need one anyway. So it's not a get out of jail free card. So please don't see it that way. It's like if it's less than that much cover, you have to have a site management plan. There's no question, just give us one. If it's, you know, more cover than that, then you have to decide, do I need a site management plan? And that's going to be site specific decision. So that's is there going to be disturbance of that material potentially from the normal use of that site, from maintenance activities, etc.? Is there going to be accessible soils? Is there a potential for people to remove that cover? All these things come into consideration, and if you have yes to any of those questions, you probably need a site management plan anyway. We're just saying you have to have one for those two scenarios where the cover is less than that amount, and you might need to have one where it's more than that amount. Not a get out of jail free card. Really wanted to make that point. The other thing is we really do want you, and I think, the contaminated sites at DoH also like to see this as well, is written acceptance of tasks by the responsible party. So if you're handing it over to local government, if you're handing it over to someone else to control the site, we want to be assured that they understand the roles and responsibilities you've given them under the site management plan to manage cover, to manage maintenance activities, to manage work exposure of workers, to have training programs and safe systems of work in place. So that's our clue, that sign off that you've actually communicated with the stakeholder and they're now aware of the obligations they have in order to prevent exposure to asbestos. So that's really important to us to see that. And there has been sites where a site management plan has been submitted and we get involved 5-10 years later, the cover's all eroded, it's now a major issue, it's in the news, people are upset, residents are really upset. So that does happen, that site management plans aren't followed through with. So they need to be a living document that are reviewed and actioned by the people that are responsible for managing the site. So I'm just going to end my talk now with supplementary guidance. It is under review and we're updating it. We're providing you a bit more information on how to deal with small scale or single surface impacts, probably around linking with WHS. So that's probably again a document that we'll collaborate with our fellow regulators on before we kind of release it. Immediate response plans, which was part of the appendices of the original document, where we're making that its own guidelines so that you don't have to look in an appendix if you have to take immediate action. You've got a document you can just pick up, and these are not going to be big documents. They're just going to be sort of short and sharp, just telling you what you need to know about those specific scenarios. We have got guidance with respect to responses to fires and other natural disasters, and we're just going to, tweak that and update that. There's not going to be a major change, just picking up on some of the learnings we've had from some of the incidents that have been around. And we have another one which is under development and which we're going to tell you about and maybe seek some input for you from with regard to long-term management of parks and nature reserves. But before I hand over to Cara, who's going to talk about that, I will take some Q&A. Yes.
Last scenario you mentioned SMPs, and that last scenario you mentioned with SMPs and handing over to government bodies like local government. In the time frame, say going back 20 years, has that got better or increasingly regular in the last 5 years, or is it, can we assume if it happened 20 years ago, virtually nothing like that? Or just to give us an idea, because when we come across these sites, we can trigger it or not trigger it, something, so.
In terms of have SMPs been in place for 20 years?
And
no.
Consistently followed?
No.
Because personally I've seen sites with very little of that.
Yes.
I've been around for 30 years, so.
I couldn't agree with you more.
So since you're mentioning it, I assume it's happening a lot more regular in the last 5 years, or just this guide that's ramping that up?
I'm not sure about the last 5 years. Maybe some of my consults. Do you feel that in the last? I mean, I know previously to the last 5 years when I was looking at it, one of the reasons I focused on this on the update is because I was rarely seeing SMPs followed after their write-up or not being incorporated as a controlled document of the organisation who's now responsible for managing asbestos. It just sat as this separate consultant report on the shelf. But in terms of the last 5 years, has anything changed, Karen?
I don't think so. I think what we put in place is the upfront reassurances that the roles and responsibilities fall to specific people, and that there's processes for review in place to ensure that errors are picked up. And we stress that it's a living document, an iterative document subject to review. And I guess that's how we try to ensure. And also, an emphasis on embedding it into existing procedures. So that's another strategy that we're promoting to hopefully ensure that they're adhered to and continue to be applied.
You know, as regulators, there's only so far us and work and go in making sure these things are sustained over time. Usually what happens is, you know, we check off that it's all been done, it's classified, it's more is on the title, and then usually the next we hear about it is that it's gone pear-shaped at some point. So I couldn't tell you about the sites we haven't heard about. Maybe there's some sites out there that are, you know, where that's all happened beautifully, but I don't hear about those. But we certainly do come across situations where the SMP hasn't been followed and we've now got a new problem and we need to do more remediation. So yeah, that does happen. Does anybody want to comment who's experienced that, who's come into a site where there was an old SMP that no one ever used and now you're the new consultant on board and you're redoing the whole lot? Yeah, I'm sure some of you have been involved in that. I know some of you have been involved in that. I know the faces in the room. Any other questions? Online?
No.
Oh, good.
There's a comment.
Comment?
There's just a comment from John, going back to public health risk. Can you talk a little bit about, I'll just sort of paraphrasing. It's from time to time we're asked to issue notices on that asbestos is an immediate risk to health, which is not how we characterise it or how we treat asbestos. Can you just comment about that? And also around the issue of public health risk, if people are struggling with that. I would just like to remind everyone of the health department. We can help you with, once you've gone through your determinations with that.
Yeah, so with public health risk, it's about air sampling. So if you want to start judging whether there's an immediate risk to public health, you can use air sampling data to assist you to see if there's any material in air, and you have to consider air sampling under the conditions that the site is being used and where there may be a risk. So that's where your conceptual site model becomes really important. What are your receptors? What are the activities happening? What are the jobs that are happening? Who are the people? And then you need to do, and if you get hygiene, this is where hygienists will come into their own. If you can get an occupational hygienist at that stage, if you're not sure from a contaminated site perspective, you can engage with an occupational hygienist who can look at, you know, that issue of immediate health risk or exposure to fibres. We're used to doing that with workplace situations. We can assist you in that space. So if you don't have the specialist skills to make the determination yourself, then get someone in to assist you with that. And certainly we're available to, as open door policy, to ask us questions, but it may be that you just need to have someone who's experienced in that space to be able to give you that better information around, is there an immediate risk to health? But yeah, understand who your receptors are, understand what work is happening at the site, and understand what your material is and whether or not it can produce fibres in air to an extent that people are exposed above public health guidelines.
Can I just ask a question about LAAs and ICPs when they come into the text?
That's one for Eve.
Yes, and for Eve as well. So with LAAs and ICPs, will there be separate categories for like asbestos containing materials and asbestos in soils, or will it all be combined so that every LAA and ICP is also demonstrated to be competent with asbestos in soils?
So there'll be no separation between, say, soils and buildings, for example, or I guess different classifications for asbestos, not that I'm aware of. So they'll be combined, essentially. Yeah.
Any other, sorry, there's an online question?
There's one more. There's one question online in regards to your comment, Karina, about the need to notify WorkSafe when intending to disturb asbestos for the purposes of a site-specific risk assessment. Under the new regs, does WorkSafe also need to be notified of soil remediation work which involves the disturbance of asbestos?
So
As far as removal works?
Okay. Right. As I mentioned, I haven't seen the finalised draft. I'm not aware that WorkSafe needs to be notified of soil remediation work.
Would it be considered removal work under the,
I think it would be considered
Regulation.
removal work, like I mentioned, Class A, Class B work. At the moment, notification of that work is only related to unrestricted or friable removal by Class A's. Under the new legislation, removal work for both Class A and Class B will be required.
Related to that, your information sheet, if fibres are detected in soil, fibrous bundles, and they're to be remediated, does that need an unrestricted licence holder, or is that best managed by competent contaminated sites consultants?
correct, the second.
Second, right, okay.
So you need to have someone who determines whether those fibre bundles in soil are trivial contamination. And so you'd have to have all the lines of evidence associated with making a decision. It's possible to make a decision that that's trivial, but you would have to support it with the lines of evidence about what state the site is in, what other sources there are, you know, whether there's been removal in the past. All those things would come into play in making a decision. So there is discretion in that decision. And that would be the assessor or the contaminated sites, either the contaminated sites assessor or an asbestos assessor.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's good.
Is that everything we've got? I think we can move on to Cara now. Yeah, and then there may still be some cookies, etc. at the end if you need a refreshment before you go.